Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I am Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged. Jerusalem Unplugged podcast is the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. And I'm very happy to announce that finally Jerusalem Unplugged podcast is back. After an unwilling break, where I had to cancel the entire podcast catalog, finally everything is back online under the new name, Jerusalem Unplugged podcast. Make sure to look for it, subscribe, like it, and leave a review. The first guest of Season 6, Episode 132, is Micaela Sahhar. Micaela is the author of Find Me at the Jaffa Gate, an encyclopedia of a Palestinian family, published by New South University Press in 2025. What does the daughter of a Nakba survivor inherit? She's asking. It is not property or tangible heirlooms, nor the streets and neighbourhoods of a father's childhood and the deep roots of family who have lived in one place, Jerusalem, for generation upon generation. So, fixing our gaze on moments, places, and objects, from the streets of Bethlehem to the Palestinian neighbourhoods of New Jerusalem, Micaela assembles a story of Palestinian diaspora. Find Me at the Jaffa Gate is a book about the gaps and blank spaces that cannot be easily recounted, but which insists on the vibrant reality of chance, fragments, and memory to reclaim a place called home. Before we delve into all of this, first things first, Micaela, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Roberto.
Okay, so let's start with basic questions. Can you tell us something about yourself and the origins of the book?
Of course. So, I'm from a Jerusalemite family who lived in the Greek colony, which is today a wealthy occupied neighbourhood in Jerusalem, as some of your listeners might know. And the properties in those neighbourhoods weren't sold by their Palestinian owners, and so we retain things like the title deeds and the keys as these, symbols of our legal and moral ownership, but for the imposition of the State of Israel. And I guess this isn't an uncommon story, that the Palestinian neighbourhoods of the New Jerusalem were very thoroughly ethnically cleansed in and after 1948. And to this day, none of the Palestinian Arab residents of those neighbourhoods have been able to return. So I suppose that locates me in a specific sense in Palestine and in Jerusalem. But then as a result of the Nakba, my family came out to Australia eventually after, several years of displacement within the Levant and in fact, even within Jerusalem. And they've spent much of their life or the rest of their lives here. So I grew up in Melbourne, which is a southeastern capital in Australia. And I studied a diversity of disciplines. I have a law degree, and I studied history, and I studied creative writing. And I think a lot, I suppose, because Australia is not a dissimilar state to the State of Israel. It's also a settler colony, and various First Nations were here before the British colonised Australia. And so I think a lot about the question of what it means not only to be a person who's been displaced through the processes of colonialism, but also what it means to be a person who, to an extent, participates in the dispossession of Indigenous people in the context that I live in. And then I suppose to think about the origins of my book, Roberto, I wrote the book in a direct sense, actually, as the result of a death, maybe a significant death, which was the death of my great aunt Najla. And I'd met her only about 5 years or 4 years before she died. And she was my grandmother's last living sister. And despite being in her 90s, she had a really powerful memory, and she was really interested, I suppose, in being in touch and sharing what she knew. And I was engaged in a project with some colleagues of mine, but also some colleagues of yours, thinking about mandate tourism. And I discovered these two guidebooks authored by a distant Sahhar relative, actually. And in the process of trying to locate the texture of those guidebooks in Jerusalem in the 1930s, I'd actually come across advertisements for a restaurant that bore my family's name in Jerusalem by the Jaffa Gate, and I realised that it was actually my grandmother's father, and therefore Auntie Najla's father. And so we were sort of engaged in this process of thinking about that cafe around the time she died. And so I had this very immediate sense of the last direct link to this landscape, this topography of Jerusalem before 1948 slipping over the horizon. And so it created this real sense of urgency for me in terms of documenting what I had, thinking about what I knew, and also speaking to the people who were still with me or with us, because I suppose with oral history you're always on the edge of living memory, but it also felt like an urgency had been created by the death of Auntie Najla. And my father and his siblings are all in their 70s and 80s and 90s now as well, so there was this sort of urgency, I suppose, in sitting down to the project. And then, of course, Melbourne, the city that I live in, had some of the longest pandemic lockdowns of anywhere in the world. And so I was separated actually we were all separated in this city from people who actually ordinarily would live really quite close by. We had radiuses that we could travel in of about 5 kilometres, so I wasn't able to visit my family or my father during that time. And so actually, as I was writing the book, or when I realised I was writing the book, I'd sort of sat down to write what I wasn't sure what it was going to be, but I discovered that it was a book, and I would finish a chapter and I would call my father, and he's not one for speaking on the phone, and this was in many ways a way of speaking on the phone together to read him a chapter, and he would often contribute more memories, or it would sort of trigger things for him, and he'd call me back and tell me another story or suggest that something else get included. And sometimes I could work it in, and sometimes it was an anecdote that went nowhere, or perhaps I've stored it away for future use.
So let's start a conversation about the book, setting up the historical context. Already you mentioned a few things here and there. Can you talk about the periods and also the geographical locations that are discussed in the book?
I mean, it's a difficult thing in some ways to pin down, Roberto, and I think this is perhaps why you've asked the question, because the book is not a chronologically written book. It's non-linear, it's atemporal in the way that it's been written. But there are really 3 key geographies in the book, and the first is where I live, Melbourne, which is where my family came in the 1950s. And so I'm thinking really about a particular suburb, the suburb of Newport, not to confuse American listeners. I believe you have a Newport in the States as well. But it was a portside suburb where a lot of refugees and migrants came in the 1950s. And I suppose the house of my grandparents was a place that created an almost portable Palestine, where there was family, there was community, there was Arabic culture and language, or Palestinian culture. And I don't know how much of a sense I had of that until the time that my grandmother died, about 50 years after they arrived. And in the church where her funeral service was being held, there weren't enough seats for the mourners. And so really there was this sense of how embedded in the community they had made themselves after arrival. So that's, one location in the story, but across time. And so the prologue begins in the Newport of the 1950s where my family arrive, and then it shifts to the late 1980s when I'm first going to school at the time of the first Intifada. And then there's a trip, or there's a engagement, I suppose, with Turtle Island, both the States and with Canada, where a lot of our family were also displaced too in the 1950s and afterwards. And in particular, the book is thinking about one trip that I was lucky enough to make with my father. It was a couple of weeks actually after I'd submitted my doctoral thesis. And although I suppose I'd intellectually understood the absence of people, to go with my father and to see him interact with so many of his first cousins who he had, they were tucked in his heart in particular ways that would have been impossible to know without making that trip with him. So that made an aspect of Nakba far more viscerally known to me than it probably had been before. I think I'd understood it in an intellectual sense, but maybe not in that visceral, lived human experience sense. And so that becomes an important part of stitching the family back together in these encounters with family, in the States and in Canada. And there's an important cousin in Canada in the book as well. And then, of course, there's Palestine, and specifically Jerusalem, which is the origin point really of the story, and which the story is journeying back to. I mean, the temporal organisation of the book is that it starts not very long after the Nakba, but it ends with the Nakba, with the experience of Nakba for my family. And so I'm thinking here really about Jerusalem through the prism of my grandfather's experience of that, particularly in the 1920s before he gets married, and then through the eyes of my aunts and uncle and their recollections from childhood, although some of them were, in their late teens by the time of the Nakba. So those recollections are quite coherent, as older people, older teens. And then I myself returned to Palestine on several occasions before writing the book, and then once I was fortunate enough to have a grant, a literary grant, to visit in June 2023. And in that time, I was pacing out distances between places that are still there, which is possible, in East Jerusalem and the old city. It's not so possible in what is now West Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem, because of, massive redevelopment projects like the Mamilla Mall project and others that's totally changed the sort of topography of that place. So those are the real geographical sort of places, and I'm experiencing them in First Nations writers in Australia have this term everywhen, and it's sort of capturing time as something that is before colonialism and that will be there after colonialism, and the way that you experience time in multiple layers and multiple registers. And in a sense, I'm experiencing place in this multiple register of time, specifically Jerusalem and also to an extent the city that I grew up in, Melbourne.
I want to ask something still related to the structure of the book. So this is a book about your family, obviously, and Palestine. And I was wondering if briefly, can you talk about the materials that you used for your narrative? How did you gather it? Given it's also very difficult to find material that is connected to families that experience the Nakba, since most of it disappeared, got destroyed, sometimes transported and then lost. And so I was wondering if you can mention something about it, and also about your narrative style. As you mentioned, this is a narrative that covers multiple places. There's no like a specific timeline. I'm an historian, so I had to do this exercise, try to figure out which period you were talking to. But eventually I found my own way go through it. So I was wondering if you can also mention this particular style.
Oh, yes, it would be my pleasure. So in terms of the materials, I mean, the book is quite researched as a framework, and I did my doctorate in really narrative and narrative appropriation and what narratives get included and what don't. And I think this triggered in me the seeds of thinking about the way in which particular kinds of stories don't get told. And in a broad sense, there's a sort of sense that Palestinian narrative isn't so well known outside of the circles that are already drawn to it, but also that even in those circles, a diaspora narrative is not often told. And so thinking about how to capture the textures of a diaspora narrative and indeed the materials of a diaspora narrative was one of the things that I was really interested to do in this book. In terms of the materials themselves, there's been a lot of work in recent years, as you would know, on revisiting archives, you know, sort of the radical archives of the dispossessed and of the Palestinian reclamation of grey literature and unusual materials that wouldn't ordinarily be so important, I suppose, in traditional archival research or studies. And I was drawing, because of my own context here in Australia, also on the work of First Nations writers and scholars who have looked at how you revisit archives that are either full of gaps or maybe very dense, but very much with the sorts of colonial knowledge or colonial interests that are not necessarily the interest of the colonised or of Indigenous people. But I was also quite lucky because my grandfather was a great documenter. He was really interested in material facts, and my aunt in the 1980s, before my grandfather died, recorded a number of tapes with him telling stories. So I sort of had his voice with me in some ways as I was piecing together the story, and a vast array of somewhat mysterious at times photographs. It's not always clear where he is or what he's doing or who he's with. But there's sort of a wealth of photographs because we have contact with some family in the States. So at some point, another large digital photographic archive came into my hands. But I think the book is also very interested in what's missing, the absences of the archives. And so there are some chapters that actually just perform speculation about things that I can't and don't know, but which seem like very important points of the story as well. And I may have only a very, very wispy amount of information to go on, and yet, I try and do this. And I suppose that leads me actually to the narrative style of the story, which is in 48 chapters, which are, as I've mentioned, not chronologically or linearly arranged, although it may surprise you and others to know that to a very large extent, I actually wrote everything in order. I didn't swap around the order of things after they'd been written. So there was very much a sense for me of the story manifesting or the story unfolding as I wrote. And as I wrote each chapter, I would often sit with an object of some sort, whether it be a photograph or there's an entry, or I call them entries, but a chapter on the mahmoul mold that my grandmother had got in Syria on a visit in the 1970s that sort of led that particular story. Sometimes I'd sit with documents, sometimes I'd sit with a particular academic exchange or notes that I had from my own travels or things like this. And so the process of putting together the story was very much materially driven and document driven. And then as I started talking to my father, he would sort of intersperse new ideas into the narrative as well. And I should say, I spent many years sitting with my eldest aunt, who, like me, has a great love of these documents and these photographs. just sitting and listening to the stories that they elicited for her. And that has changed over time, you know, as memory starts to become a bit of a different beast as people age, that those memories have become inaccessible or more difficult to pin down or map onto a broader historical narrative. But this was very much the process of writing the book.
Since you talked about family, actually I want to move to what I believe is the main character, at least in my view, of the book, which is your grandfather. And I was wondering if you can talk about him and also about his wife, Ellen, and your relationship with them.
Yeah, sure. So my pa actually died when I was quite young. I was in my, I was very much in my childhood. He died in the late 80s and I would have been 8 or 9 years old. But he left a really big impression, I think, on everyone who knew him, myself included. But he also lived with me, I suppose, through both his voice on the tapes that I've mentioned, but he was also a very central character in the stories that my aunts and my father would tell. And because we had this wonderful archive of photographs of him, these were also evocative of a much younger person, you know, certainly not the person I met. And I bring this up in the book that, you know, I think of him and the transitions he makes in his life through the various names that he has through his life. So he has, of course, his Palestinian name, Abdullah, but then he becomes Albert in Australia. And then, of course, he becomes my pa. So there's actually 3 names at play in the book that position him in different times. But my pa was born at the turn of the 20th century to a family that were from Jerusalem, and he became a tour guide, and he had good English, although he wasn't really schooled. And there's a story in the book about his experience of schooling, which is, you know, quite amusing and somewhat disastrous, and speaks to the many different religious denominations in Palestine at the time. And he was also a wonderful storyteller. And so he loved talking about the ways that he would show people around Jerusalem and around the broader Levantine area. I mean, there are beautiful pictures of him from Baalbek in the 1920s and 30s. And then there are pictures of him showing soldiers around Jerusalem in World War II, actually. And then his family also had a furniture business, and this was on Mamilla, and they had a showroom on Mamilla, and eventually they ran the sort of tourism office out of the. I mean, it was sort of a mixed business, as many Palestinian people had, and sometime in the 1920s, he'd also bought a block of land from the Greek patriarchate who were selling off land in what became the Greek colony, and he built a place at Assis Street. And as in the Arab style, it was flat roofed so that more apartments could be added as the family expanded and people got married and had children. And you know, I think in a sense, in a sort of psychological sense, I get the impression that my grandfather lived in that house all of his life. I mean, the way that he would tell stories about it and sort of pace through the house, you know, with the key in his hand, sort of drawing it in the air and evoking the sort of beauty of this haven that he'd built for his family with a beautiful garden. And I think it was one of the great tragedies in some ways of the Nakba that it was not possible for him to ever return to Jerusalem in his lifetime, or indeed to be buried in Jerusalem, which had been his dear wish for many, many years in Australia, which he gave up at some later point. And so in many ways, my relationship to my grandfather is one that I've built intellectually, I suppose. You know, there's the impressions of a child, but then there's the intellectual construction of a relationship to a person through photographs, through stories, through the stories he told. My grandmother had quite a different life and experience. She was quite a bit younger. She was a good decade younger than my grandfather, and she was the eldest daughter of a family of 9. And for that reason, she was somewhat unlucky in that she was the guinea pig of the family. And so a marriage was arranged for her, although she had been sent to the Friends School in Ramallah. And she was a clever student, and she'd received a scholarship to the American University in Beirut, where she'd wanted to become a teacher. And unfortunately, she was unable to take up that opportunity due to this imminent marriage. But she was so distraught, actually, about the marriage at the time that her father, who must have been quite a thoughtful gentleman, did not arrange any other marriages for his daughters, and he had 5 more to marry off, but everyone else, married actually sometime later, not particularly young, and married for love, I believe. And many of them also had careers in teaching around Palestine before they were forcibly displaced by the Nakba. So she was a great lover of stories and a very resourceful person who, I learned, in fact, after her death, had adapted many traditional recipes to the conditions of migration to Australia. I mean, her hilba, which I write about, she had adapted quantities to sit in a very, very Australian cake tin, for a lamington tin. A lamington is a particular Australian sort of slice, if you like, but her hilba recipe fits the dimensions of that tin perfectly. And she lived, I was lucky. She lived a lot longer into my 20s, but my father was quite young in his family, and so I didn't get nearly as long as some of my other cousins with those people. But Roberto, the other main character in the book is, of course, my dad. He's really the sort of lineage, as much as he's not the story per se. I mean, I think you're right. I think it is my grandfather and Ellen who sort of, to a large extent, carry the narrative, and necessarily carry the narrative of Palestine before 1948, because it's really their city to move around in. And but my father's also a very important dimension to the book. He's the missing link there. Yeah.
I certainly have a missing link, but it struck me. I mean, the figure of your grandfather really resonates throughout the book, and it feels like this grand character almost in every chapter. So it's really his presence, while you read the book, you can feel the presence of your grandfather. I want to talk about identity, because, your book is very much about cultural identity, and you are a Palestinian Christian, and in the book you talk about this a number of times, in fact. And so I was wondering if you can speak about your identity in general, your cultural identity, but also about religious identity, and how does this relate to the Palestinian cause at large, and also how does it relate to your personal life?
Oh, thank you for that question. That's a big one, Roberto. So you're right. I mean, my family are Christian Palestinians, and I suppose Christian Palestinian operates as quite a useful identity marker, but maybe particularly for me growing up in the time that I did, Christian Palestinian as a diasporic Palestinian, because it allowed me to always and already be aware of the problem of framing and of representation, and the fact that Israel's relations with the Palestinians was often framed as a religious clash. And so there was something inherent in my understanding, before I really had a political understanding or an historic understanding of what had happened to Palestinian people, that this identity somehow was already a shorthand that allowed me to understand that the way things were being represented were not necessarily the way things were. And, I guess the Christian Palestinians, who were a significant minority in Palestine before 1948 were particularly a minority in urban settings, like Jerusalem, and a lot of those people were people who were displaced. I mean, I think there was quite a large exodus of the Christian Palestinians from urban areas in Jerusalem. And so before I really had a political or historical awareness of Zionism, or really an understanding of what had happened to Palestinian people and had been allowed to happen through a Western consensus, I already had a sense of the really problematic ways in which Palestine was, and to an extent still is, explained in Western contexts and Anglospheric contexts. But, my aunt, who's been quite unwell recently, and she was in hospital, and she was dredging up this memory of going to take communion at our local parish, which was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And she was saying to us, well, the Muslims cared for the church. And of course, that's true. And it made me think a lot about the sorts of relationships which are replicated time and again in Palestine, and the care which different faiths and denominations have shown for each other. And I'm thinking here also about, the cooperation of the denominations who all have a stake in the Church of the Nativity in the 2002 siege of the Church of the Nativity. And also of a town near Bethlehem, Al-Khada, which was where the St. George Monastery and Church is, but which is also a town that's really been cared for by its Muslim constituents. And then I suppose there's the particular story of religion in my family, which is that they were Greek Orthodox Christians, but in some ways as a result, I think, of the Nakba and of the political atmosphere that led up to that, the sort of Zionist terrorism that occurred throughout the 1940s in the neighbourhoods they lived, really. And, part of the revelation of the book for me was thinking about this chain of terrorist events, if you like, from the bombing of the King David Hotel to the riots that break out at the end of 1947 after the partition plan, to the bombing of the Semiramis Hotel. And that, there's a story which I tell in the book, which is of an aunt and my great-grandfather actually believing that they won't make it through the night because people are shooting at the house that they're in, and laying face down on the floor and becoming quite literally born again overnight. In my grandfather's case, I think his conversion was a little earlier than that, although again I do see it within the sort of spectrum of the deals people make with their faith during cataclysmic events, But in another sense, there was something for my grandfather, I think, in taking on a more evangelist faith, which was that in the churches that he would visit in Australia, he felt welcomed, and he would heckle ministers when they got the geography of Palestine wrong as they were describing various biblical stories. And I think it was a way for him to make Palestine present, to actually have a conversation about it. And I think it tells you something about the flexibility of his faith. I mean, my mother was a Catholic, and he would take communion. And, I tell this story in the book, but my mother had said to my grandfather, communion is for Catholics, Mr. Sahhar. And he'd said, don't worry, Maxine, God recognises me. And so, he had a very capacious relationship to the possibility of religion, maybe also foreshadowed by the childhood his childhood education, moving around to these different denominational schools and being educated in different faiths. And, I suppose there are other thoughts, and some of them I touch on in the book. There are other thoughts I have about why they may have shifted faith. But the other thing I should say is they were not, despite converting to a sort of more unorthodox form of religion, they weren't really proselytizers. So they had 6 children, but 4 of them were not religious at all, and they were the elder 2 who had started out life as, you know, Greek Orthodox, and the younger two who largely grew up in Australia, which was my father and my youngest aunt. And certainly in the 90s in Australia, in a very different way perhaps to the States, it was a very secular time. So we didn't really grow up with religion as being anything other than a certain sort of cultural marker, I would say.
In the book, you also mention your meetings with Patrick Wolf. Now, Patrick Wolf is an important historian that wrote about settler colonialism that you had the pleasure to meet and talk to him. And I was wondering if you can speak briefly about his work for those who don't know him, but also about how these meetings shaped each other's understanding of Palestine. Because I think this is a central part in the book that you really kind of help understanding what you're trying to tell people behind the family narrative.
Oh, gosh, that's an interesting question. I mean, Patrick Wolf, actually, I met him when I was looking for a doctoral supervisor. And it was several years in the end before I did start that project. And he helped me work up a project, and for various reasons it was not possible. They were sort of bureaucratic administrative reasons within universities. It didn't end up being possible for Patrick to supervise the project, but we became firm friends, and the friendship was really bookended, I suppose, by Palestine, that attempt to develop a doctoral project with him, but then quite by chance and, you know, really very luckily, I had discovered that Patrick would be making a trip to Palestine at the same time that I was there at the end of 2015. And, you know, you understand this with hindsight, that this was very close to the end of his life. It was a couple of months before he died. And I suppose it's thinking about the end of your question, it was an interesting moment because it was probably the only time I felt that I had something to share with Patrick or to teach Patrick. And, you know, in some ways, I don't think that's true. Patrick was quite a remarkably egalitarian person, and I think he was learning from everyone all the time, and he always treated people as equals, whether they were, you know, local people from the regional town that he lived in, or students or colleagues. You know, he was really a really generous intellectual and a really generous friend. But we had these interactions about what to do at the crossing, you know, from Amman into the West Bank, or from at the Allenbury Bridge. And I'd gone back in the process of writing the book to look at these really long emails that we'd written to each other about our apprehensions. And I was already in Palestine, and I'd just come from the States where I'd been visiting some other family members, and one of them had told me that she'd been strip searched. And as I was writing the book, I was reminded of that. And I thought, how would you not remember that? It's so horrific. And I thought, well, I guess it's because so many horrific things happen, you can't store them all up and have them front of mind, or you'd be frozen. You know, you wouldn't be able to do the work you do as a Palestinian in the context that Palestinians find themselves in. But you also, I suppose, have to acknowledge that if it happened to a different sort of person, it may well become a very life-defining event for them, you know, to be strip searched at a border in the way that that this occurs for Palestinian people. But of course, Patrick's work, when I met him, it was actually the year, I believe, that his most famous essay came out, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, which has become such a defining text for me and many other people. You know, I mean, its relevance it's still extraordinary. I was teaching it earlier this year to a class who were learning about decolonisation. And of course, something I think that's often missed about Patrick's work is that he's thinking about the mentality really of the settler, not of the colonised, or the oppressor, not of the oppressed. And he's thinking about the commonalities or the patterns between places. So Patrick spent a lot of his life in Australia, And so he was very interested in these patterns in the Australian context vis-a-vis British colonialism and First Nations people. But in that particular essay that I've just mentioned, he also does some really important work in thinking about, Israel as a comparative settler colony with Australia. And he was not the first to do it, but this was an essay that got, an enormous amount of attention. And was actually a really useful essay for me as a person positioned in Australia, I think, to think about these things in comparative ways and to not need them to be identical in order to apprehend the commonalities between them, which I think is some of the very important work he does. But actually, in thinking about that, again, about that essay, and it's hard to talk to his body of work, Roberto. I mean, I teach so much of it, but, in different contexts. I mean, he covered a lot in his publications. But I was thinking recently, actually, about the optimism to an extent in that essay where he says that, identifying, I suppose, the structures for genocide could allow us to disrupt those structures. And yet here we are 19 years later watching a genocide in real time that's sort of been ongoing for several years. It's not for want of brilliant structural analysis that might have helped us change course.
Let me go back to family. And follow me, because this is a point I want to ask, which has to do with diaspora, as you're already talking about, for instance, your relative in Los Angeles. So every family has skeletons, right? In other words, I just want to use an image here, what I call, we don't talk about Bruno. If you ever watch the Disney movie Encanto, then, this is your cultural reference. Now, there is a specific chapter where you talk about your uncle. And that's a fascinating story. But thinking about your uncle, I start linking that figure to questions related to diaspora. For instance, the question of the language, whether one should or not speak in Arabic. And so I was wondering if you can kind of like develop a little bit more the figure of your uncle, but connected to the question of your experience and of your family experience living in the diaspora.
Yeah, I mean, that particular uncle is somewhat unique in the family. He's the only person who left Jerusalem and who left Palestine of his own choice. And I started thinking about this because a cousin sent me an entry in the British Mandate publication, the Palestine Gazette, where they would list various changes to businesses, like the registration of businesses, the change in ownership of businesses. And it registers that my pa and his brothers had bought this brother out of the partnership. And, it's from this that I can sort of date perhaps when he left Jerusalem and left Palestine. And I guess because he was a voluntary migrant, his experience of what happened is very different, to other members of the family. I mean, he's a person who's less traumatized by the events of the Nakba than other people in the family were. And actually, he's the reason why my grandfather and another of my grandfather's brothers came to Australia as well. So he'd moved around quite a bit. He'd been in Britain. He'd actually had a cafe in Cyprus, and eventually he'd come out to Australia. And because he was here, he'd been able to apply for the visa forms for my grandparents to come out. And, these are wonderful documents, absolutely riddled with errors. He gives my grandmother the wrong name. He gives various people the wrong birth dates. He gives people middle names they don't have, But really it's because he's here and because my grandfather's a bit older, certainly old for the era. He's in his late 40s when that application is made in 1948 or 9. They just want to accept a visa, to whichever country would accept them first. And so because they had that familial connection, it was possible to come to Australia. But as I was finishing up the book, I had given it to my youngest aunt to read as a certain, ethics check, a final ethics check for my family, and she wrote a number of notes accompanying her reading of the book. And her memory of this particular uncle was actually very loving. And she said, "Oh, I know he was a bit of a rogue, but I always had a really soft spot for him." And she was sort of elaborating on all these, memories that she had of him, which were actually quite different to memories of, other members of the family. And I suppose, that particular uncle is an uncle that I personally have very little recollection of, although he was here in Australia, and we certainly shared some time together on this earth, although he wasn't a very present person in my life, and certainly not someone I ever had the chance to speak to or interview about his experiences, which I think would have been absolutely fascinating. But in some ways, he also provided a little bit of a model for me for thinking about other people in the family who I hadn't met and who I could imagine or speculate about their stories. And there's a chapter quite late in the book called The Seamstress of Jerusalem about a sister of my grandmother's who I imagine is quite like me for, she married very, very late in life. She didn't have children. She was interested in history and poetry. She cooked Hilbert. So, these certain passing similarities. And this seemed to me not necessarily as a skeleton, but to also be a way of trying to piece together or speculate on these really central or axiomatic figures in a family about whom little is known. And in some ways, maybe that's the point. The point is representing, as I was saying before, I think, the absences as well as what it's possible to be certain about or possible to document and archive. In terms of speaking Arabic, this was a point of great pain for me at particular parts of my life. I think the experience of my father and his siblings being schooled in Australia was that they had, accents, and they showed up to school with slightly embarrassing, ethnic lunches that nobody wanted to swap with them. And so the dream for them in some ways was for a full assimilation of their children. And so there was, we weren't taught Arabic, although Arabic was very much in the home, but it wasn't something we were taught. But in the case of my father, there's another dimension to that, which is that although Arabic is his first language, he never learnt to read or write Arabic. So his Arabic is a particularly limited form of Arabic, which is a orally learnt Jerusalemite dialect from 1948. And so, there's a moment in the book, but, this has been true of my father's life in Arabic, if you like, that people will understand him, but he will struggle to understand other dialects because he doesn't have a flexibility in the language. He didn't learn Fusha. His language is very locked to a particular time and place. And so I suppose that's another reason why we didn't learn it. But this is not an uncommon experience. Actually, quite a lot of people have reached out to me since reading the book, and they've managed to find my work email, and they've written to tell me that the book was, very meaningful to them. And they come also from diaspora families, and often from diaspora families where eventually someone's married out, as my father did. My father didn't marry an Arabic-speaking person. And they've also lamented the fact, that Arabic has been lost in their family. And look, at this point in my life, I haven't been able to recover it either. But I think this is very much a sense of it's a small instance of the larger project of assimilation and of coloniality that, you lose your language as one of the facts of the colonial experience. And maybe I was saying it earlier, but, you have sort of the state from which you've been expelled making claims that you don't exist at all, and then the state to which you've come making claims that everyone is part of some great amorphous identity, much like in the States, that these are very much settler colonial nations built on various waves of immigration at the expense of the Indigenous people who were there. And so the dream is really sort of an Anglospheric dream in some ways.
I have a couple more questions. And one is about what you write towards the end of the book. So you ask two questions, which I'm going to ask you. Who are the Palestinians? What is the Nakba?
I mean, there's a sense that the book is trying to understand that itself, it seems to me. They're inwardly directed questions as well as being outwardly directed questions. And I'm investigating these, and I'm insisting on particular answers. And those answers are perhaps different to how Palestinians have come to think of these things, and how other people have thought about these things as well, by which I mean, and maybe relating actually, Roberto, to my earlier answer, I think the diaspora has been very much divided from a sense of the sort of, Palestinian polity of those who remained in 48 in the West Bank and in Gaza. And in some ways, the book is an argument, amongst other things, for reclaiming a sort of diasporic archipelago of Palestinian people. But it's also to urge, and I should say I drafted this book in 2020, so it was before the Unity Intifada, which did, I think, mark a bit of a change in the psychology of how the Palestinian diaspora was relating to, ancestral Palestine. But very much a sense that the diaspora sort of disappears because its story isn't told, and that the diaspora disappears because it's been squashed by the narratives of these states that have sort of claimed them in their own sort of citizenship dreams, in the Anglosphere. And it might actually be opposite for me in thinking about what is the Nakba to read a little section from the book. I don't know if we have time, but maybe just a couple of paragraphs, because there was very much a sense, I suppose, while I was writing, that there was always the intellectual understanding of Nakba, but it was only when I managed to travel back to Palestine and also to the States with my father that I developed a sense of Nakba as something that is multi-generational. And although it's sort of although family displacement is maybe a secondary impact of Nakba, I mean, I think there's very central violent things that we do need to centre around what the Nakba is, such as what's happening in Gaza right now. But this comes from a chapter, my grandmother was the only member of her family to come to Australia, and it's something that was very painful for her for the rest of her life. She was very close to her sisters, and she was a very early adopter of Skype, actually, in the late 90s and early 2000s, because she missed them so bitterly. And there was a point at which one of her sisters wanted to come out to Australia, and she said, it's bad enough that one of us is out here suffering. It'd be better to go to the States because, as you and I were talking about, Roberto, Australia really is just so very far, and more so in the 1950s and 60s than it is today. But as a result of all of that, she made one big trip a couple of decades later and never saw any of her sisters again. So, there was maybe to riff off Patrick Wolf's theories that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, so too is the experience of Nakba through generations, I think. There is a photograph of Pa, of Ellen and Badia standing in front of a ship that will take Ellen out in 3 parts to Australia. There is something on Badia's face, although I have never seen this picture, but I know what it is. On Badia's face is written, quite simply, Nakba, because, as Patrick Wolf will say many years later, Nakba is not an event, but a structure, because Nakba happens to Badia again at this separation, because Nakba describes the separation that begins when Ellen steps onto the ship, pictured behind her, and will go on happening and happening for the rest of her life. Sad to say, this is a thing that I know but will not grasp until some 11 years after Ellen dies, when I am visiting America, too late to meet Badia, but when I meet Najla. And Najla confides in me that because Ellen lived in Australia, her death was indistinguishable from long separation. And Najla continued to live as if Ellen was as far away as she had been through their lives until the day that we meet. And I hope this remained true until the day Najla died 4 years later.
I'll have one last question after this moving moment. Your book is very much like the Oscar-winning movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I had that kind of feeling. At times it feels like you're in a multiverse, which is a good thing. It really is kind of shaking you, and it makes you feel different feelings at different times and moving from a place to another, from a time period to another. And so I tried to ask you questions, following my historian hat. I need to have a sort of like a period and a geography and so forth. So I feel like I missed something. And I was wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask that you want to discuss as a conclusion to our conversation.
Oh, thank you for this question. It's funny, when I was looking at this question that you so kindly sent through before, I was struggling a bit with the comparison, but I've thought a bit about it, and maybe to explain it like this. I actually come from a background in creative writing of poetry, and although I chose to write this as a prose text for various reasons, I'm very much informed by the training of poetry. And I think with poetry, there's a sense of playing with time and with tense in a way that other ways of writing are less often doing. And I have a lot of opportunity to think about this because throughout my years of study, I taught English for academic purposes to people of, not from non-English backgrounds. And I would think to myself, when you can read poetry as a second language user, you really master a language because of the way that it's so playful with time and space. And so in some ways, the way that the book was put together was very much informed by this bending of time and of tense and of bringing in this idea, to an extent, this First Nations idea I mentioned earlier of the everywhen, that time is with you, that all times are with you, I suppose, in the present, that your ancestors are with you, that the future is to an extent with you. But I guess also because there's certainly a political project to this book, although it wasn't intended to be didactic as such, but much more a creative and narrative-based work. But there was very much a sense with this project that I didn't want people to imagine that the story was about some sort of regrettable past that's in the past. Rather, I wanted to connect the reality, the contemporary reality for Palestinian people, especially in Palestine and in Gaza, to that past, to think about injustice from 77 years ago as being a very present injustice today. And although I didn't write the book during this current moment, the majority of the sort of, the editing, the structural editing, as it's called, did happen under the same genocide that we're still sort of living through. And so there was very much at that point a political consciousness about, well, what is the relevance of a book that can't speak to the present moment, and to realise, of course, that the past is the present and that the present moment can only be explained, it seems to me, by the past. I don't think it's really possible to understand a genocide in 2023 or 2024 or 2025 without understanding what happened in the 1940s, what happened in 1948, and what's happened to Palestinian people every day since that time. I also wanted to write a book, though, and I hope this doesn't sound like a contradiction. I think often, and certainly my experience growing up in Australia and as a sort of Palestinian advocate, was that many of the platforms that Palestinian people were offered to speak in was in what I would describe as frankly unacceptable dialogue contexts, as if Palestinian rights were somehow debatable, as if some people's feelings, and I mean this is an issue we're having right now with questions about anti-Semitism, and I'm sure there's similar issues that are happening in the States. The trouble with the way that we're talking about anti-Semitism in Australia at the moment is as if some people's feelings of being uncomfortable are equal to or even more important than other people's lives, which is, it should go without saying, but it obviously doesn't, a hugely distorted way of thinking about what's happened to Palestinian people in the last 77 years. And so I really wanted to write a story, I suppose, that tried to tell a Palestinian diaspora story on its own terms that was in many ways uninterested by Israel. And in some ways that's why I want to link a past Palestine, the Palestine that, you know, my pa and my Ellen and my aunts and my uncles were kind of walking around in, with a present experience, and to the extent that it's possible to not have that particularly encroached by questions of what it might be like, you know, for Jewish Israeli people or, you know, the state of Israel, but rather to tell a Palestinian story in its own framework and on its own terms.
This was Micaela Sahhar, author of Find Me at the Jaffa Gate, an encyclopedia of a Palestinian family, published by the University of New South Wales Press in 2025. Micaela, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.